Who lives in the deserted regions of Minhiriath and the Enedwaith in Lord of the Rings? There's these big areas on the map, very big areas really, which you can see sort of around here, which are apparently completely abandoned, or virtually completely abandoned. And it's been a question that's niggled me for a long time in terms of that being the standard account of things, and just thinking about why are they abandoned. Let's talk about them. This is Tolkien Trivia, by the way, where I talk about odd little side streets, and this, I grant, is one of the oddest side streets. I'm partly inspired to come back to this topic, which I've considered before, because of a recent pair of articles on Medium by the demographer Lyman Stone, who's talking basically about how many people live in Middle-earth. And a big thing for him is that where a common fan estimation of population is 3 million people live in northwest Middle-earth, on medieval European bases, plagues and all, you could get about 27 million. And his revised estimate, and I'll return to some of his ideas in this video, and I'll link in the description, but he suggests, well, even if you put in a big depopulation premium, then you might be still looking at 9 million, so 3 times the population. And part of the interesting thing here is that when you look at who would live on what land, when and why, Minhiriath and the Enedwaith, which are kind of, Minhiriath is the southern part of what was the old northern kingdom of Arnor, which is what Aragorn is heir to, and Enedwaith was the very far northern section of Gondor. This is some of the best land, seemingly, in between forestry and large amount of arable land, going in the whole of Middle-earth. Now, here's what we have that we know. One, there's not really any mention of anything going on in these places. No large settlements. Two, there is a general suggestion from Boromir when describing his journey, though he talks about the bridge of Tharbad having been destroyed, and it being very tough to cross there and it being very deserted, etc. When he's at the Council of Elrond. And in Appendix A, I think it is, there is a mention of the destruction of Tharbad, or desertion of Tharbad, in Appendix B in 2912 Third Age. So we know that several hundred years before the Lord of the Rings, a large settlement, the largest settlement left in the area, had been deserted. Prior to that, during the Great Plague, which happens in Third Age 1636, the Minhiriath was largely deserted, apparently, because of the Great Plague that had swept across Cardolan and killed off most people. That's mentioned in Appendix A, under the Númenórean Kings in the Eredor section. It's nearly completely deserted, but we do hear of a residual population in Minhiriath. The Enedwaith, I don't think there's any real mention of residual populations, but we do in the tale, the history of Galadriel and Celeborn, in Appendix, this is an unfinished tales, and this is in Appendix D of that, about the port of Lond-Dare, which had been an elven port on the Grey Flood, and which is abandoned, and then the major port becomes Tharbad. So what we have is fairly recently before Lord of the Rings, but still hundreds of years before, a major settlement is abandoned, and we hear from Boromir that the bridge has fallen to ruin. And 1,000 years before that, we hear that the Minhiriath has been significantly deserted due to the Great Plague. So we hear, between these problems, floods and plagues, the Minhiriath and the Enedwaith are largely deserted. Now, Lyman Stone's point, and something I've always thought, is that it doesn't make sense for people to not settle these lands at all. We're talking about large areas of, at best, marginal grassland, which you could herd, you could be pastoralists on. But also, you could well be talking, especially with it being a major watershed, alluvial soils, we could be talking about quite fertile land for crops. And it's not in great danger from any natural enemy. There's been bad weather events, certainly. But if you, for instance, if you look at the Mayan collapse of around 900 AD, which may partly have been climactic to do with volcanic eruptions, if you look at that, it's not that then no one ever lives in any of these places again for thousands of years, or even hundreds. In some cases, you actually have people returning to some of those ruins later, and in all cases, virtually, those ruins seem to continue to be seen as ritual sites by people who have moved to a very slightly different region. There are lots of things going on with that abandonment. No one really knows what happened. But if we take climate as a major feature, which it probably was one feature, it doesn't lead to simply the whole place being abandoned permanently with no one, with all this these valuable, the valuable soil and valuable land and stuff being unused. So it doesn't make sense that Minhiriath and Enedwaith are completely abandoned, but we are told some people live in Minhiriath, and I'll go to the section. As I say, I don't remember any residual population, and I haven't found that in my research, but please correct me in the comments. But yeah, Tolkien, this is Appendix D, the Port of Londare, to the history of Celeborn and Galadriel, Galadriel and Celeborn, and we are told that the Númenórean's taken over and so on and so forth, and that, yeah, essentially what is left over by the time of the late Third Age, presumably, is a small population of forest men in Minhiriath, and you can see it on the coast. I'll get the map here. You can see the forest we're presumably talking about, the Erin Vaughan, just by my finger there. There's the Erin Vaughan there. So south of the Elven kingdoms of Lindon, very close actually. One thing, by the way, Lyman talks about is, and I think is fairly compelling on, as are the other estimates around it, by other people, about elven populations in the First Age and the Third Age. There are far more elves than you would think in the Third Age. There functionally must be. He offers some interesting discussion about why doesn't Círdan get more involved, given he leads comfortably the largest elven kingdom. But yes, anyway, you can read that on his article. So Minhiriath and Enedwaith have apparently very few people, but according to Lyman, presumably we're still going to, and I think, like I say, I think these are compelling figures, compelling suggestions. You've got a densely populated region going south, which is still going to be, hundreds of thousands of people, presumably. I'll just find his suggestion. Let's go. The density might be still, even after depopulation, which it might still be at 25 people per mile or 20 people per mile, with the largest areas of population being Old Arthedain, so the Shire and Breland, Anorian and the coast, so because you've got Minas Tirith and Pelargir, which are probably the biggest cities in Middle-earth, and Rohan. That's the places you're going to have the densest population, and I guess also Lothlorien, places like that. But maybe on a slightly lower, but still maybe about 20 people per square mile, which is moderately dense, especially in a largely agricultural world. They've got to be there somewhere. So I think probably what we have to read into this is that Tolkien, when he says, it's largely depopulated, we're talking from a position where there presumably were millions of people. In the same way there were maybe 3 million elves in the First Age in Middle-earth, in northwestern Middle-earth. There were millions of people in the Minhiriath and Enedwaith, the prime agricultural land. You've got a major settlement at Tharbad. And remember, because here it's not that you have 25% of the population in the city and everyone else lives outside. You've got 5% or a couple of percent of the population in the city, because society is so much more agricultural. So you have a large settlement. You have some other settlements. It goes up to Eregion and the great, and Moria earlier, though that's not a going concern by the back end of the Third Age. But it's a historically populated region. Commerce comes up from Gondor to Arnor, and even after disasters strike and depopulate it, there's a strong reason for people to go back. It is hard not to believe that there are at least some pastoralists. Maybe in the Enedwaith, you've got them coming from Dunland. Maybe in Minhiriath, you are talking about the forest folk, being on the margin of the Erin Vaughan. Perhaps you're talking about Avari. You might be talking about dark elves. You might be talking about numbers of pastoralists, because there are people keep animals, and presumably that doesn't mean that everyone lives within a mile of Bree with their 1,000 head of cattle. You're going to have people wandering there who range all the way up to Old Arthedain from the top of from the middle of Old Cardolan. So you've got reasons why you don't need to have large settlements, and you don't even need Tolkien to have said, oh, by the way, there were 100,000 people here spread out. He says there are people living in the forest, a few bands of secretive hunter folk, can still quite reasonably be tens of thousands of people in a pretty large forest and surrounding area, the margins of the forest. And then you add in other people, as I've described, and you can get to that point of having a sensible partial resettlement of these areas before the time of Elessar, even taking into account the kind of almost dramatically exaggerated decline and depopulation of Middle-earth and Lord of the Rings. Even bearing that in mind, you can see that these are areas where, though you wouldn't necessarily see them as you're riding along the ruined Greenway from Gondor to Rivendell, they're there, they're watching, they're in the corners, descendants partly of Númenóreans, partly of the old woodmen and forest men, cousins of the Púcal men. It seems like one thing is that possibly some of those in the Erin Vaughan, maybe Druedain. You can see you can see how this might work, how that might come together. And I think it fills in our picture of where people get food from in Middle-earth and how it works. And you might say, well, but this is just a silly book that we're all meant to just enjoy. Oh, wonderful, One Ring, Fellowship, go on a quest, eagles. But in fact, this is something that Tolkien was deeply interested in, the functionality of his world. And I think adding to that and thinking about the demography of it helps it genuinely and legitimately enrich what he was already doing. Anyway, you tell me what you think. You give me your detailed demographic estimates and thoughts. And I will see you next time.